It started like hell. Those are the words of a real person, a real civilian, a sailor, someone whose job is to move the world's goods from one port to another, a person who signed up to work on cargo ships, not to be trapped in a war zone. It was total chaos. In the nighttime also we could see the missiles getting intercepted. It was very dangerous. We got very panicked. That audio was shared by the United Nations International Maritime Organization. The sailor's identity was protected for their safety. And right now, as you watch this video, that sailor, and approximately 20,000 others just like them, are still trapped. 20,000 civilian seafarers, on 2,000 vessels, stuck inside the Persian Gulf, behind the closed Strait of Hormuz, unable to go home, unable to safely move, rationing food and water, watching missiles fly overhead at night, sleeping, or trying to sleep, in the middle of an active combat zone. They are not soldiers. They are not combatants. They didn't choose to be in this war. They were just doing their jobs, moving oil, moving cargo, moving the goods that keep the modern world running when the war started around them. And the world has almost completely forgotten they exist. This is their story. I'm your name. Welcome back. Today we are telling the story that the cable news networks keep skipping over, because there are no explosions to show, no dramatic military footage, no geopolitical chess moves to analyze. There are just 20,000 human beings, stranded at sea, in a combat zone, waiting for someone to remember they're there. Let's get into it. Before we get into how they got trapped and what their days look like right now, we need to understand who these 20,000 seafarers actually are. Because they are not an abstraction. They are people, and their stories deserve to be told. Seafarers, merchant sailors, are among the most invisible workers in the global economy. There are approximately 1.9 million of them worldwide. They work on cargo ships, oil tankers, container vessels, bulk carriers, chemical tankers, and liquefied natural gas ships. Their job is to crew these massive vessels, some of which are longer than 4 football fields, and move them safely from port to port across the world's oceans. They deliver your car, your phone, your clothes, your food, the fuel that heats your home, the raw materials that built the building you're sitting in right now. As one maritime union official put it plainly, they deliver 90% of everything that we use on a day-to-day basis. And they do it in conditions most people would find unimaginable. Extended contracts of 6 months or more, living on a ship far from home, far from family, no weekends, no days off, limited internet, limited communication, constant noise from engines, constantly shifting watch schedules that disrupt sleep. The physical demands of maintaining massive machinery in all kinds of weather. And when things go wrong, when ships are caught in wars, when ports close, when companies go bankrupt, seafarers are often the last people anyone thinks about. Now let's talk about who specifically is trapped in the Persian Gulf right now. The overwhelming majority of the world's seafarers come from the Philippines, India, Indonesia, Russia, and Ukraine. They are typically from working-class backgrounds, often supporting large, extended families back home. Their salaries, while not enormous by Western standards, are often among the highest available in their home countries. Becoming a merchant sailor means being able to send your children to better schools, buy a modest house, care for aging parents. Captain Raman Kapoor is one of the people trapped in the Gulf. An Indian captain, he spoke to NPR's reporter Dia Hadid from Mumbai, his port of contact with the outside world, while his ship sits stationary somewhere in the Persian Gulf. His family's message to him, relayed through the journalist: "We just wanted him home alive. After all, if you're alive, you can make more money." There's Santosh Kumar, another Indian seafarer who was stranded at Iran's Khorramshahr port. He managed to pay his own way out. He scraped together the money to get himself home while most of his colleagues remain behind. And then there are the thousands who remain, whose names we don't know, whose faces we'll never see on the news. Sitting on ships in the Persian Gulf, playing table tennis to pass the time, trying to keep their morale up, writing WhatsApp messages home, looking up at the night sky and watching missiles streak across it. Raman Kapoor summed it up in a WhatsApp message to the journalist who interviewed him. Monotony is harsh. Monotony.
In a combat zone. That's what 20,000 civilian workers are living through right now. To understand how 20,000 civilians ended up trapped in a war zone with no immediate way out, you need to understand the sequence of events that unfolded with terrifying speed starting on February 28, 2026. When the US and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, the coordinated strikes on Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the Persian Gulf was operating normally. Approximately 3,000 vessels passed through the Strait of Hormuz every month. Tankers were loading oil in Saudi ports, in UAE terminals, in Qatari LNG facilities. Cargo ships were moving goods to and from Gulf states. Everything was running. And then, within days, everything stopped. Iran retaliated with massive missile and drone attacks on U.S. military bases and Gulf Arab states. The IRGC Navy, Iran's Revolutionary Guard naval force, began issuing warnings to shipping. On March 2nd, an IRGC official made it official. The strait was closed. Any ship attempting to pass would be targeted. For the ships already inside the Persian Gulf, already past the strait, already loading or unloading cargo or waiting at anchor, the door slammed shut behind them. They couldn't go forward. They couldn't go back. They were inside. And then the attacks started. The International Maritime Organization has confirmed at least 21 attacks on commercial ships since the war began. At least 10 seafarers have been killed. Several more have been seriously injured. One sailor on the vessel Skylight was killed on March 1st, just 3 days into the war. 4 others were injured. The MKD Viam was struck by an Iranian drone boat. The explosion ripped through the engine room. An Indian sailor was killed. The remaining crew of 21 had to abandon ship and evacuate onto a neighboring vessel. Another Indian seafarer on the LCTIA was critically wounded. And this is just the documented confirmed attacks. The actual number of incidents is almost certainly higher. Ships whose crews were too frightened to report. Incidents that occurred in areas with limited monitoring. Vessels whose owners had reasons to keep incidents quiet. Meanwhile, the U.S. imposed its own blockade of Iranian ports on April 13th, making the situation even more complicated. Now ships were caught between 2 blockades, trapped on one side by Iran's control of the strait, trapped on the other by the American naval blockade, preventing ships from leaving Iranian ports. The IMO Secretary General Arsenio Dominguez put it simply and chillingly. There is no safe transit anywhere in the Strait of Hormuz. Not just reduced transit, not just risky transit, no safe transit, anywhere. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You wake up in a small cabin on a ship. It's barely large enough to stand up and turn around. You've been sleeping in this cabin for weeks, months now. The walls are close, the ceiling is low, the engine hums constantly through the metal floor. You look out the porthole. The Persian Gulf is flat and gray in the morning light. Another tanker is anchored nearby. You can see it on the horizon. There's another one beyond that. You're all just sitting here, waiting, like a parking lot, but at sea. You go to the mess hall for breakfast. The cook is rationing food now. Supplies are running low. Charities like Mission to Seafarers have been trying to resupply ships with food and water, risking their own workers' lives to bring provisions to stranded crews. But not everyone is getting enough. Not everyone is being reached. You sit with your crewmates. Nobody talks much. There's not much to say. You've already said everything you can say. You play cards. You play chess. You exercise on the small deck space available. You watch movies you've already seen 3 times. You video call home if the internet connection is working. You look at your children's faces on a tiny screen and try to tell them everything is okay, even as, the night before, you watched missile contrails arc across the sky while standing your watch. Because that's the other thing. Even when it's quiet,
Even during the ceasefire periods, the truces that have come and gone, the psychological toll is immense. The International Transport Workers Federation, the union representing over 16 million transportation workers globally, has been fielding calls from stranded seafarers. Its maritime coordinator, Jacqueline Smith, described the situation in a single devastating word: desperate. "I think it's desperate," she said. "I think it's unbelievable that this is happening." She described the uncertainty and fear that dominates every inquiry they receive. Seafarers asking, "When can we go home? When will this end? What happens if we run out of food? What happens if our ship gets hit?" And behind those questions, an even more immediate one: can I even leave? The answer, for most of them, is no. Maritime law, international law, compels seafarers to keep their ships safe and operational. They cannot simply walk off their vessel, even in an emergency, even in a war zone. The ship must be maintained. A minimum crew must be present at all times. Abandoning a ship is only legally permitted under the most extreme circumstances, if the vessel is actively sinking. So they stay, not entirely by choice, but because maritime law requires it. And because they have nowhere to go even if they left. They're in the middle of the Persian Gulf, surrounded by a war. And then there's a darker dimension to this: the crews who have effectively been abandoned by their employers. When companies can't secure new cargoes, when the economics of maintaining a ship in a war zone become untenable, some ship owners simply stop paying. They stop communicating. They leave their crew stranded on the vessel without wages, without support, and without any clear plan for getting them home. This is called abandonment in maritime law, and it is illegal. But it happens, especially in times of crisis. In 2025, even before the Iran war began, 6,223 seafarers were abandoned on 410 ships. Early indicators for 2026 suggest that number has already exceeded 6,000 cases in just the first few months of the year. 6,000 people abandoned by their employers in a war zone. So who is helping these 20,000 people? The honest answer is, not enough people. Not fast enough. Not at the scale the crisis demands. The International Maritime Organization has been sounding the alarm since the crisis began. IMO Secretary General Arsenio Dominguez has engaged directly with the parties involved, urged diplomatic solutions, and called publicly for humanitarian corridors that would allow stranded ships, or at least their crews, to evacuate. The IMO Council passed a resolution calling for a safe maritime framework, specifically designed to facilitate the evacuation of merchant ships from the Gulf. They established a dedicated UN task force on the Strait of Hormuz to work on technical mechanisms for humanitarian needs. That task force exists, it meets, it issues statements. Meanwhile, 20,000 sailors are still trapped. The United Kingdom hosted a virtual meeting of foreign ministers from more than 40 countries to discuss the situation. 40 countries. 40 governments, represented at ministerial level, all aware of the problem. Meanwhile, 20,000 sailors are still trapped. NPR's journalist Dia Hadid asked the United States State Department directly, "Will the U.S. help civilian seafarers leave the strait?" The State Department did not respond. Let that sink in. The world's most powerful navy, which is actively present in the Persian Gulf, which is escorting some vessels through the strait, has not committed to specifically helping civilian seafarers evacuate. Some countries have done better. India, which maintains diplomatic relations with Iran and imports 90% of its natural gas from the Persian Gulf, negotiated the safe passage of Indian seafarers. They used their unique diplomatic position to cut a deal and get their people out. But India is the exception. For the seafarers from the Philippines, from Indonesia, from Ukraine, from Russia, from dozens of other countries, there is no government negotiating on their behalf. There is no navy coming to escort their ship out. There is no diplomatic back channel securing their release. There is charity. The Mission to Seafarers organization, a maritime welfare charity,
has been trying to resupply stranded ships with food, water, and essential supplies. Their workers take small boats through waters where mines have been laid, and IRGC speedboats patrol. They risk their lives to deliver water to people who are dying of thirst, not literally, but practically. The irony is almost too painful to state. The wealthiest, most powerful governments in the world, with aircraft carriers and destroyers and nuclear submarines in the region, cannot or will not secure safe passage for civilian workers on unarmed cargo ships. But a charity with small boats is trying. And here's something else that rarely gets mentioned. Many of the sailors who have managed to get out paid for their own escape. Industry officials confirmed to NPR that some shipping companies paid Iran directly for their ships to pass through the strait, effectively paying the IRGC a toll to be allowed to leave. And individual sailors like Santosh Kumar pooled their own money and paid for private passage out. They paid their own ransom to escape a war they never signed up for. Let's be very clear about what's happening here from a legal and moral standpoint, because the polite, diplomatic language of shipping disruptions and maritime incidents obscures a very uncomfortable truth. Attacking civilian ships is a war crime under international law. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, signed by most nations, including Iran, establishes the right of innocent passage through international straits. The Strait of Hormuz is an international strait. Blocking it to civilian shipping violates this principle. Attacking merchant vessels violates the laws of war and international humanitarian law. The IMO has confirmed at least 21 attacks on commercial ships, 10 seafarers killed, multiple vessels damaged or destroyed. These are war crimes, not incidents, not tensions, war crimes against civilian workers. And the seafarers themselves have no protection beyond international law, which, in a war zone, is worth only as much as someone is willing to enforce it. The Maritime Labor Convention of 2006, the international standard for seafarer rights, guarantees certain protections: repatriation rights, access to food and water, payment of wages. In a crisis like this, those rights become essentially unenforceable for thousands of workers. The Conversation magazine described what these workers face in blunt terms. Up to 20,000 seafarers on 2,000 vessels remain stranded in and around the strait, enduring a combination of physical danger and psychological stress typical of combat zones. They face daily horrors at work. Daily horrors, typical of combat zones. That's the reality for 20,000 civilian workers who went to work on cargo ships and ended up in a war. And there's a historical parallel here that is both instructive and sobering. During the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, approximately 400,000 seafarers were stranded at sea. Countries closed their borders. Crew changes were impossible. Sailors who had completed their contracts couldn't go home. Some went months, over a year in some cases, without being able to leave their ships. The world called it a humanitarian crisis. Organizations raised alarm. Governments eventually acted, slowly, incompletely, but they acted. Right now, 20,000 people are stranded in far more dangerous conditions, in an active war zone, with missiles flying and mines floating around them, with food and water running low, with employers going silent. And the world's response has been slower and less organized than it was during a public health emergency. If the Strait of Hormuz crisis drags on, if the diplomatic impasse between Iran and the United States continues without resolution, what happens to these 20,000 people? The answer is deeply troubling. Food supplies dwindle further. The mission to resupply ships is already difficult and dangerous. The longer the crisis continues, the harder it becomes to maintain adequate provisions for 20,000 people on 2,000 vessels. Rationing will become more severe. Some ships will face genuine food and water emergencies. Mental health deteriorates. The psychological impact of being trapped in a war zone, unable to go home, unable to move, watching missiles fly at night, hearing explosions in the distance, compounds with every passing day.
Maritime psychologists have documented the long-term damage that extended confinement at sea causes, even under normal circumstances. In a combat zone, the damage is exponentially worse. Contracts expire, and keep expiring. Seafarers who signed 6-month contracts are now months beyond their end date. They should legally be able to go home. Instead, they're legally bound to their ships by maritime law. The longer this goes on, the more workers are effectively being held against their will, even by their own employers and the laws designed to protect shipping. More vessels get abandoned. As the economics of maintaining ships in an inaccessible war zone become increasingly untenable, more companies will stop paying their crews. The abandonment numbers, already alarming, will grow, and the attacks may resume. Every time the fragile ceasefire between the US and Iran has wobbled, shipping in the Strait has become a target again. A breakdown in negotiations, which appears increasingly possible, could restart active combat. And 2,000 ships with 20,000 civilian workers on board sitting in that zone would face catastrophic danger. The IMO Secretary General has used unusually direct language for a diplomatic official. He has said that fragmented responses are no longer sufficient, that the situation requires urgent, coordinated international action, that the safety and well-being of these seafarers is the paramount concern. Paramount, his word. And yet the world keeps debating nuclear programs and oil prices and blockade terms, while 20,000 human beings play chess to pass the time and watch for missile contrails in the Persian Gulf night sky. 20,000 people. They deliver your phone, your clothes, your food, the fuel in your car. They spend months away from their families, their children, their homes, living on ships in the middle of the ocean, so that the modern world can function the way you expect it to. And right now, 20,000 of them are trapped in a war zone, rationing food and water, watching missiles fly overhead, waiting for someone to decide that their lives matter enough to act. This story deserves your attention. Not because it's dramatic, though it is. Not because there are explosions to watch, though there were. But because these are human beings, ordinary working people caught in the middle of a geopolitical crisis they had absolutely no part in creating. Share this video. Tell someone about these sailors. Make sure this story doesn't disappear into the background noise of geopolitical coverage. If this gave you something today, something to think about, something to feel, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want coverage that goes deeper than the headlines. The next video is ready. We'll see you there.